Hey there, tonight we're talking about the full story of Aphrodite, the goddess of love, beauty, and everything in between. From her ancient origins to the myths, the drama, and how she's still part of culture today. If you enjoy these types of relaxing history videos, make sure to subscribe, it really helps. And while you're here, let me know in the comments, where are you listening from, and what time is it right now where you are? Alright, get comfortable, let's begin. You've probably heard the name Aphrodite at some point, maybe in a classroom, maybe in a video game, or maybe in one of those Greek mythology memes floating around online. But behind all the simplified, filtered versions we hear today, there's a much deeper story. And no, Aphrodite wasn't just the pretty one. She wasn't just some ancient goddess people lit candles to for good looks or date night luck. Her story is layered, political, emotional, sometimes tragic, sometimes powerful, and always central to how the ancient world understood love, war, jealousy, and beauty. She wasn't just a goddess of love. She was love, desire, power, obsession, chaos, creation, and sometimes total destruction, all rolled into one. To really understand her, we need to go back thousands of years, before TikTok, before Caesar, before even written history in some places, back to when the Greeks were still building their earliest myths, borrowing stories from older civilizations, adapting what they could into their pantheon. And in the middle of that swirling mix, she shows up, not with a sword, not with thunder, but with something far more dangerous, beauty that no one could resist, not even the gods. There are two main versions of how Aphrodite came into existence, and both are completely different. The first one, it's intense. It starts with Uranus, the original sky god, being overthrown by his own son, Cronus. During that brutal act, Cronus slices Uranus open, and part of him falls into the sea. From the churning ocean foam where those remains landed, something forms. That something is Aphrodite. Yeah, that's right. In one version of the myth, the goddess of love was born from one of the most violent moments in creation mythology. She didn't grow up, she didn't crawl out of a crib, she just appeared, fully formed, adult, and already too beautiful for words. The second version, a little more polite, comes from Homer, where Aphrodite is the daughter of Zeus, and a lesser-known goddess named Dione. That take makes her more of a typical divine child, still important, still radiant, but not as dramatically born. The Greeks couldn't even agree on her origin, but they all agreed on her impact. And it didn't take long for her presence to completely reshape Olympus. Now here's the thing, when Aphrodite arrived, the other gods weren't thrilled. They were confused, maybe even a bit anxious, because even though she didn't hold a weapon, her power was unlike anything they'd seen. She had this ability to sway minds, to cause gods and mortals alike to lose their grip on logic. Wars would be started, lives would be changed, cities would fall, all because someone got too caught up in desire. And most of the time, Aphrodite was standing somewhere in the background, calmly watching it unfold. And Zeus, the king of the gods, with all his thunderbolts and paranoia, saw the problem right away. So what did he do? He tried to contain her. Zeus arranged a marriage between Aphrodite and Hephaestus, the god of fire and metalworking, a kind of trade-off. Marry the quiet craftsman, keep her tethered, reduce the drama. But of course, it didn't go the way Zeus hoped, because Aphrodite didn't love Hephaestus. In fact, she barely respected him. She spent most of her time with someone else entirely. Aries, the god of war. And this is where things get messy. Aphrodite and Aries had a long-running, very public affair, one that everyone on Olympus knew about. And Hephaestus, well, he found out too. So he crafted this intricate, invisible net made of metal so fine that even the gods couldn't see it. Then he caught them in the act, and dragged them into the hall of the gods for all to see. Embarrassing, for sure, but Aphrodite didn't break. She wasn't afraid, she didn't even pretend to be ashamed. If anything, the whole incident only made her more famous, more legendary. Now here's where most modern versions stop. They show you that Aphrodite was pretty, that she caused some drama, and then they move on. But we're not doing that here, because this video, this story, is going to dig into all of it. Every rumor, every myth, every time she intervened in human lives, shaped the outcomes of wars, made heroes fall in love, destroyed families, saved entire civilizations, and even got injured herself. We're going to talk about the judgment of Paris, where she played a direct role in starting the Trojan War by offering Helen of Sparta as a bribe. We'll talk about her relationship with mortals, like Anchises, the Trojan shepherd, who she seduced and then bore a child with. That child, Aeneas, the ancestor of the Roman Empire. We'll talk about how the Romans renamed her Venus, elevated her into the mother of Rome, and began using her image for politics, culture, art, and war. Caesar himself claimed descent from her, and we'll even get into how she was worshipped, not just by men hoping to win over a crush, but by entire cities. Her temples weren't small shrines hidden in gardens, they were major religious centers, sometimes involving rituals that still baffle historians today. Through it all, we'll look at how she was seen, not just as an object of beauty, but as a force of nature, a power you didn't challenge, a goddess you respected, a figure who could gift you pleasure, or destroy your life with a glance. And beyond the myths and temples, we'll explore her legacy, in paintings, poems, sculptures, fashion, even science. From Botticelli's Birth of Venus, to the planet named in her honor, Aphrodite's influence didn't fade, it adapted, it evolved. Let's talk about something that often gets brushed aside when people think of Aphrodite, her power, not beauty, not charm, actual power, influence, control, the kind that gets under people's skin and makes kings change their minds, the kind of power that makes gods uncomfortable. You see, when people imagine the Olympians, Zeus throwing lightning bolts, Poseidon shaking the earth, Hades ruling the underworld, Aphrodite often seems like the odd one out. No weapons, no monsters, no underworld army. She just walks into a room, and suddenly no one's thinking straight. But that kind of influence, that's its own kind of weapon, and the other gods knew it. Aphrodite wasn't just powerful because she was beautiful. She was powerful because she made people want. And when people want something badly enough, they make mistakes, they betray, they start wars, they break rules, and she could make that happen with just a glance. Let's look at how that power played out across Olympus. The first real example, Hera. Now Hera wasn't just Zeus's wife, she was the queen of the gods, the goddess of marriage, family, structure, the opposite of chaos. She valued loyalty, control, tradition. So naturally, Aphrodite, a goddess who stirred up feelings, disrupted order, and made people fall for all the wrong people, at the worst times, was not Hera's favorite person. The rivalry wasn't open warfare, but it ran deep, especially during the events leading up to the Trojan War. That's where things came to a head. Here's the setup. There was this wedding, not a mortal one, but a divine one. Perseus and Thetis were getting married. Yes, that Thetis, mother of Achilles. Every god and goddess got an invite, except for Eris, the goddess of discord. She didn't take it well. She crashed the wedding, and threw down a golden apple labeled "to the fairest." 3 goddesses stepped forward, each convinced it was meant for them: Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite. And just like that, it turned into a full-on power competition. Zeus, smart enough to stay out of it, passed the decision to a mortal, a Trojan prince named Paris. The 3 goddesses appeared before him, each offering a bribe. Hera promised power, kingship over all of Europe and Asia. Athena promised wisdom and success in battle, and Aphrodite, she promised love, specifically the love of the most beautiful woman in the world, Helen of Sparta. Paris chose Aphrodite, and that decision changed the course of history. Why? Because Helen was already married to Menelaus, king of Sparta, and when she ran off with Paris to Troy, it triggered the entire Trojan War. That one moment, Aphrodite offering Helen as a reward, is one of the clearest examples of how her power wasn't just personal. It was geopolitical. She could cause global-level problems with a single gift, and she didn't stop there. Throughout the Trojan War, Aphrodite took sides, always in favor of the Trojans, especially Paris and her mortal son, Aeneas. She protected them, guided them, pulled them out of danger when needed, even when it meant going against the other gods. At one point, Diomedes, a Greek warrior, actually wounded her in battle, slicing her wrist. She fled the battlefield, in pain and humiliation. That moment, small as it seems, is huge. It shows that despite all her influence, she wasn't invincible. She could be hurt, but even then, she remained a key player, and she got even with the Greeks in the long run, because when Troy fell and her son Aeneas escaped, she watched over him. She protected him as he wandered, helped him find safe passage, and guided him toward Italy. According to Roman mythology, Aeneas eventually became the ancestor of Romulus and Remus, the founders of Rome. So if you follow that myth, Aphrodite didn't just cause the fall of Troy, she planted the seed for the rise of Rome. That's long-term thinking. Now let's zoom in on another Olympian, who had issues with Aphrodite, Artemis. Artemis, the goddess of the hunt, was the polar opposite of Aphrodite. She represented chastity, independence, and the wild. She had no interest in love or seduction, and she didn't tolerate anyone messing with her followers. And that brings us to the story of Hippolytus. Hippolytus was a mortal prince who worshipped Artemis. He rejected all forms of romantic love and completely ignored Aphrodite's influence. In his mind, love was a distraction, a weakness. He wanted nothing to do with it. Aphrodite didn't take that lightly. In response, she orchestrated a tragedy. She caused Phaedra, Hippolytus's stepmother, to fall madly in love with him. It wasn't just uncomfortable, it was destructive. Phaedra, overwhelmed by her feelings, tried to seduce him. When he refused, she accused him of assault. Hippolytus was exiled and eventually killed. It's one of the darkest myths associated with Aphrodite. It wasn't about passion, it wasn't about war, it was about punishment, about what happens when you deny the power of love, or worse, insult it. Now whether you see that as cruel or symbolic is up to interpretation, but the message was clear. You don't ignore Aphrodite. Even gods learned that the hard way. She clashed with Athena too. Athena represented logic, strategy, and restraint. She couldn't stand the chaos Aphrodite brought into human lives, especially during wartime. While Athena wanted calculated decisions, Aphrodite introduced emotion into the equation. Lovers would run off together, kings would make irrational decisions, soldiers would fight for passion rather than reason. It was like they were constantly playing two sides of the same coin, wisdom versus desire, order versus chaos. Now let's circle back to the god who probably had the most complicated relationship with Aphrodite, Hippolytus. It's easy to reduce Hephaestus to the jealous husband stereotype, but it goes deeper than that. Hippolytus was a god who represented craftsmanship, invention, and patience. He built weapons, palaces, jewelry, even the armor Achilles wore in the Trojan War. He wasn't flashy, but he mattered, and then he gets married to her, the most desired being in the entire pantheon. It was never a love match. Zeus arranged the marriage. Some say it was a reward for Hephaestus's work. Others say it was Zeus's attempt to tame Aphrodite by tying her to someone less threatening, but it didn't work. Aphrodite didn't stop seeing Aries. She didn't apologize for it either. And when Hephaestus exposed the affair in front of all the gods, hoping for outrage, the gods just laughed. It was humiliating, not just for him, but for her too. Their marriage was basically symbolic from that point on. Still, Hephaestus kept creating, and Aphrodite kept doing what she did best, influencing the emotional balance of both divine and mortal realms. And that's what makes her so different from the rest. She didn't need to threaten people or throw lightning. She didn't need to rule the sea or underworld. She could walk into any room and change everything. No force, no fear, just desire. And when gods fear desire, you know it's powerful. Let's shift our focus from Olympus down to Earth for a bit, because when Aphrodite turned her gaze to mortals, things often got even more complicated. She wasn't just a goddess who stayed in her temple while people lit candles and prayed for a good date. She showed up in people's lives, sometimes subtly, sometimes overwhelmingly, and the mortals she got involved with, they rarely came out of those encounters unchanged. Some fell in love, some went mad, others became legends. Let's start with Anchises. Anchises wasn't a hero, he wasn't a king, he was a Trojan shepherd, just a guy living his quiet life in the hills near Mount Ida, minding his sheep. Not exactly someone you'd expect to be caught in the sights of a goddess, but that's exactly what happened. According to the Homeric hymn to Aphrodite, Zeus, maybe annoyed that Aphrodite kept making everyone fall in love all the time, decided to teach her a lesson. So he caused her to fall hopelessly for a mortal. Not just fall in love, but fall hard. So Aphrodite comes down to earth, disguised as a mortal woman, not in armor, not in glory, just in beauty, natural, radiant, impossible to ignore. She walks into Anchises' life like a dream. They spend a night together, and he has no idea who she really is. Only afterwards does she reveal the truth. And his reaction is pure panic. Because sleeping with a goddess wasn't something you bragged about. It was dangerous. People went blind. People died. The stories were full of mortals being punished for crossing lines with the divine. But Aphrodite, to her credit, reassures him, tells him he'll be safe. She's not here to punish him. She's here to give him something. That something is a son, Aeneas. Now that name might not sound like much yet, but keep it in mind, because Aeneas goes on to play a huge role in mythology and history. We'll come back to him later. For now, just remember, Aphrodite didn't just bless Anchises with a one-night stand, she gave him a legacy. Next, we move to Pygmalion. Pygmalion was a sculptor from Cyprus, one of Aphrodite's most sacred islands. He was a perfectionist, obsessed with creating beauty, but ironically, he couldn't find that beauty in real people. According to the myth, he was disgusted by what he saw as the immoral or superficial women around him, so he decided to create his own version of perfection. He sculpted a statue, a woman made from ivory, with such care, such love, that she seemed more alive than stone. Every detail was flawless. Her face, her posture, her hands. He dressed her, spoke to her, kissed her forehead, not in a creepy way, in a lonely, desperate way. This wasn't just an artist admiring his work. This was someone who had poured everything into something he believed in, and it wasn't enough, because at the end of the day, she was still just stone. So during a festival for Aphrodite, Pygmalion did something he'd never done before. He prayed, not for riches, not for fame, just this: give me a bride as perfect as this statue, he said. Aphrodite heard, and when Pygmalion came home, he reached out and touched the statue's hand, and it was warm. The statue, which had never moved, turned her head toward him. She blinked. She breathed. She was real. The myth says her name became Galatea, and she became his wife. They had a child named Paphos, named after the city where this miracle supposedly happened. The story is sweet, but it also says something about Aphrodite's role. She wasn't just stirring up scandal. She could also reward deep, sincere longing. She could see love where others saw obsession, and when it suited her, she could make dreams real. But not every story has a happy ending. Let's talk about Adonis. Adonis is one of the most important figures in Aphrodite's mythology, not because of what he did, but because of what he represented. He was beauty, pure, youthful, fleeting beauty, and Aphrodite loved him. He was immortal, a hunter. Some myths say he was so handsome that Aphrodite couldn't resist him. Others say she raised him from infancy, after his mother was cursed and transformed into a tree. Whatever version you believe, the core of the story is this: Aphrodite loved Adonis deeply, and he loved her in return. But their time together was limited, because Adonis wasn't just a symbol of love, he was also a symbol of loss. He would go hunting alone against her warnings, and one day he was gored by a wild boar. By the time Aphrodite found him, it was too late. She wept over him, and where her tears mixed with his blood, red anemones bloomed. The flower became a symbol of his memory, and of the shortness of life. The story doesn't end there. In another version, Persephone, queen of the underworld, also fell in love with Adonis. The two goddesses argued over who got to keep him. Eventually Zeus stepped in and made a decision. Adonis would spend part of the year with each of them, and that division of time, half with Aphrodite, half with Persephone, became a way to explain the changing seasons, life and death, bloom and decay. In some cities, women would hold small festivals for Adonis. They'd plant fast-growing seeds in shallow pots, the gardens of Adonis. They'd sprout quickly and wither just as fast. A perfect metaphor. Now you might be wondering, why does all this matter? Because these stories weren't just entertainment for the ancient Greeks or Romans. They were explanations, warnings, lessons. Aphrodite wasn't just a goddess who gave people butterflies in their stomach. She was the unpredictable force behind love, and everything that came with it. Longing, obsession, joy, destruction, healing, grief. She could bring people together. She could tear them apart. She could give you the thing you wanted most, and then make you question why you wanted it in the first place. She was more than a face or a name. She was a reminder that love, in all its forms, isn't safe. It's powerful. It changes people. It shifts loyalties. It creates heroes. It causes wars. And it doesn't ask permission. That's why the gods both respected and feared her. That's why mortals built temples in her name, not just to honor her but to stay on her good side. Coming up in the next chapter, we'll step out of myth and into ritual. We're going to look at how people actually worshipped Aphrodite in the ancient world, from Cyprus to Corinth, from private homes to public festivals, what offerings they gave, what symbols they used, and what they believed would happen if they crossed her. Because for a goddess without a sword, she had some of the most loyal and nervous followers in history. Let's really break down what made Aphrodite's relationships with mortals and her interference in their lives so complicated. We talked about Anchises and how she seduced him to birth Aeneas, but it wasn't just a one-time romantic episode. That one act rippled into centuries of storytelling. The Trojans saw Aeneas as a prince. The Romans saw him as a founder, and later leaders, like Julius Caesar, literally built their family trees backward to link themselves to her. Think about that. This wasn't a goddess content with being a background character. Aphrodite planted bloodlines. She didn't just bless cities, she became the reason they claimed legitimacy. And Aeneas's journey, it's more than just a post-Troy wanderer story. It's one of survival, destiny, and divine manipulation. Aphrodite protects him, sure, but she also pushes him, guides his path, steers him toward Italy. When he falls in love with Dido, queen of Carthage, Aphrodite is behind it. When he leaves her, breaking Dido's heart so badly that she commits suicide, that's also part of the divine plan. Aphrodite doesn't stop to ask, is this fair? Her goals are bigger than that. She plays a long game. Her interest isn't in temporary feelings, it's in creating legends, shaping the next empire. So while Zeus, Poseidon, and Athena throw lightning or raise oceans, Aphrodite moves people, quietly, permanently. Now, let's look at another mortal she touched, in a very different way, Paris of Troy. Paris didn't have the ambition of Aeneas. He was a prince, sure, but he didn't seem destined for greatness. That changed the moment Aphrodite stepped into his life. We already covered the Golden Apple, the contest that sparked the Trojan War. But let's go deeper into what actually happened after he chose her. Aphrodite promised him the love of Helen, not just any woman, but the most famously beautiful woman in the known world. The problem, Helen was already married to a king, Menelaus of Sparta, and Sparta wasn't a place known for taking things lightly. So Aphrodite follows through. She causes Helen to fall for Paris, and just like that, history shifts. Now, was it real love? That depends on which version of the myth you read. Some say Helen truly fell for Paris. Others suggest she was enchanted, manipulated by divine forces. But the end result is the same. Helen leaves her husband, the Greeks unite, and the siege of Troy begins. And here's the part most people forget. Aphrodite didn't vanish once the war started. She was there, in the background, nudging events, protecting her favorites. She didn't just favor Paris. She shielded him in battle. When he was about to die, she intervened, pulled him away, hid him. In one scene from Homer's Iliad, when Paris is about to be killed by Menelaus in a one-on-one duel, Aphrodite literally swoops in and teleports him back to his bedroom. Not exactly a warrior's exit, but it proves her loyalty. But this created tension among the gods, because while Aphrodite protected the Trojans, Hera and Athena backed the Greeks. That turned the Trojan War into more than just a human conflict. It was a divine civil war in disguise, and Aphrodite wasn't passive. She was active, engaged, and she didn't just care about Paris. Her son Aeneas was on the battlefield too. When Diomedes, a Greek warrior, wounded Aphrodite as she tried to protect Aeneas, it was a huge deal, a mortal hurting a goddess. That's rare in myth. Aphrodite fled to Olympus, bleeding and humiliated. And yet her resolve didn't weaken. She didn't grab a sword. She didn't scream for revenge. She stayed in her lane, manipulating emotions, guiding decisions, and quietly ensuring the survival of her bloodline. Aeneas survives. Paris doesn't. Troy burns. But Rome rises, all connected to her. Now, if you look at these stories, a pattern starts to emerge. Aphrodite doesn't care about who's good or bad. She doesn't pick sides based on morality. She picks based on legacy, influence, destiny, and then we get to the darker stories. The ones where her influence isn't protective, it's disruptive, even cruel. Let's go back to Hippolytus. Hippolytus worshipped Artemis, and he made a point of rejecting Aphrodite, not just ignoring her but actively shaming her influence, publicly declaring that love was a weakness, that desire was beneath him. And in the world of mythology, that's not just rude, it's dangerous. Aphrodite responds in the way only she can, not with thunder, not with a curse, but with a feeling. She causes Phaedra, Hippolytus's stepmother, to fall deeply and uncontrollably in love with him. Phaedra is tormented. She knows it's wrong. She tries to resist, but she breaks. She confesses. Hippolytus is horrified, rejects her, and in her shame and panic, Phaedra accuses him of assault before taking her own life. These are not cartoon-level myths. These are raw, intense, deeply human stories about emotions that destroy people from the inside. Aphrodite doesn't lift a finger in this myth. She never appears directly, but she doesn't have to. The damage is already done, and that's what makes her different from the other gods. They act on the world. She acts through it, subtly, deeply, permanently. In ancient literature, she's both worshipped and feared, not because she punishes with fire, but because she punishes with longing, with confusion, with heartbreak. She makes people feel too much, and sometimes that's worse than pain. So when we talk about her having no temples of war, or not leading armies, we're missing the point. Her battlefield is internal, her weapon is desire, and no one, mortal or god, is immune. Even Zeus himself had to limit her. Marrying her off to Hephaestus wasn't just an arrangement, it was a control mechanism, but it didn't work. She still found her way into every major myth, every bloodline, every decision that mattered. She was always there, just off to the side, watching, smiling, shifting the balance with a glance. Now here's something to think about. When the ancient world talked about gods, they weren't just talking about characters in stories. They were explaining the forces around them, why people fall in love, why they make bad decisions, why they throw away everything for someone they've only known for a week. And for the Greeks and Romans, the answer to all that was simple: Aphrodite. Next we'll explore how that answer shaped real life. Because Aphrodite didn't stay confined to myth. She had real temples, real rituals, real priests and priestesses, and the way people worshipped her tells us a lot about how they understood love, beauty, and fear. Now that we've explored how Aphrodite moved through myth, let's talk about what that actually looked like on the ground, in the real world. How did people worship her? What did devotion to Aphrodite look like in daily life? Because Aphrodite wasn't some abstract concept or forgotten name in dusty scrolls. She was active. She was worshipped for over 1,000 years, and the things people did in her name ranged from beautiful to deeply strange. Let's start with geography. If you were an ancient traveler moving through the Mediterranean, you'd quickly realize that Aphrodite had roots in more than one place. Most gods had a clear home. Zeus had Olympus, Apollo had Delphi, Poseidon had the sea, but Aphrodite, she had islands. Her worship centered in places like Cyprus, Cythera, and Corinth. Each place treated her a little differently, but Cyprus was the big one, especially the city of Paphos. According to myth, this is where she first washed ashore after rising from the sea foam. And what did they do to honor her there? They built one of the grandest temples of the ancient world, a sanctuary so influential that people from all over the eastern Mediterranean came to pray, offer gifts, and ask for help in love, fertility, and relationships. This wasn't just a room with a statue and a few candles. The sanctuary of Aphrodite at Paphos was massive: courtyards, altars, priests, processions, animal sacrifices, and people of all classes, from farmers to kings, came through. Cythera, another island said to be linked to her birth, also held festivals in her honor. Boats would arrive in the harbor carrying offerings. Worshippers carried statues through the streets. Temples were filled with flowers, perfumes, and music. It wasn't a quiet, solemn experience. It was joyful, chaotic, deeply sensory. And in Corinth, things took a different turn. Corinth was known in the ancient world for being one of the wealthiest and most cosmopolitan cities in Greece. And its temple to Aphrodite stood at the top of the Acrocorinth, a high rocky outcrop that overlooked the city. Now here's where it gets controversial. Some historical sources claim that this temple employed hundreds, some say over 1,000, priestesses who practiced what we'd now call sacred sexuality. These women weren't just servants of the temple, they were part of an elaborate system of worship that involved intimacy, ritual, and offerings. Visitors, including wealthy merchants, politicians, and travelers, would come to Corinth, make a donation to the temple, and in return spend time with one of Aphrodite's priestesses. To the ancient mind, this wasn't immoral, it was divine. To participate in love, beauty, and pleasure was to honor the goddess herself. Aphrodite wasn't seen as someone to fear for these acts, she was the very reason they existed. Now historians debate how much of that is true and how much is exaggerated. Some think the stories of thousands of sacred prostitutes were propaganda invented by rival cities like Athens to smear Corinth's reputation. But even if the numbers were inflated, the core idea remains: Aphrodite's temples weren't about cold rituals, they were about connection, sensuality, life force. Elsewhere in the Greek world, worship took on more symbolic forms. In Athens, for example, Aphrodite was honored in the gardens. People would tend to plants and flowers, offer wreaths, and leave sweet-smelling oils. Myrtle and rose bushes were considered sacred. Doves were her messengers, gentle birds that symbolized peace and devotion. Married women would offer small personal prayers to Aphrodite, Urania, a title meaning heavenly Aphrodite. This version of the goddess wasn't about lust, but about long-lasting emotional love. Marriages, partnerships, and children fell under her care. On the other hand, sailors, yes, sailors, would often pray to Aphrodite for calm seas. Why? Because she was born from the ocean, she represented beauty and the sea's mercy. Before voyages, sailors would visit her shrines, leave offerings, and ask for protection. There's even evidence that soldiers prayed to her before battle, especially Spartans, interestingly enough. In Sparta, Aphrodite was sometimes worshipped as Aphrodite Aries, the warlike Aphrodite, not in the sense of bloodshed, but in the sense of courage, unity, and the desire to return home to those they loved. Just shows how fluid her image really was. She wasn't boxed into one category. She could be gentle or fierce, local or universal, personal or political. And then there were the festivals. One of the biggest was the Aphrodisia, held each summer, usually around late July or early August, in many Greek cities, especially in Athens and Cyprus. During the Aphrodisia, her statue would be bathed in sacred water. Priests and priestesses would cleanse the temple with rituals, music, and fire. Then came the offerings: garlands, fruit, incense, birds, sometimes small sacrifices of doves. There were dances, poetry readings, and a kind of public celebration of love in all its forms. For some it was about romantic connection, for others about fertility and childbirth. For others still, it was a moment to reflect on inner peace and ask the goddess for clarity in relationships. In Rome she became Venus, and things got even bigger. Romans saw Venus not just as a goddess of love, but as the literal ancestor of their people. Julius Caesar claimed direct descent from her through Aeneas, that gave her a political dimension she never had in Greece. Temples to Venus were placed in high-profile locations, next to forums, palaces, even battlefields. There were multiple forms of her worship: Venus Genetrix, Venus the Mother, Venus Victrix, Venus the Victor, and Venus Closimel, Venus of the Sewers. Yes, seriously, symbolizing purification and renewal. Each form reflected a different angle of her influence: motherhood, victory, civic duty, even hygiene. The Veneralia, held every April 1st, was one of her most popular festivals. Women, both patrician and common, would come together to wash the statue of Venus, offer incense, and pray for success in love and relationships. Perfumes flowed, music played, and like the Aphrodisia, it was less about solemnity and more about joy. What's amazing is how these festivals, rituals, and beliefs weren't limited to one region or one social class. Aphrodite was for everyone. She wasn't just the goddess of kings and heroes, she was the goddess of lonely potters, nervous brides, traveling fishermen, pregnant mothers, hopeful lovers. People whispered her name before proposals, asked for her help during childbirth, begged her to mend broken hearts. Even today, pieces of her worship remain, in wedding flowers, in love songs, in Valentine's Day cards. The symbols changed, but the energy behind them still the same, and all of that, every wreath, every whispered prayer, every carved statue, every festival, kept her alive. Not just in memory, in culture. Aphrodite didn't just live on Olympus. She lived in people's daily lives, in their rituals, in their hopes, in the quiet moments between heartbeats when someone asked, "Does this person love me back?" That's the kind of power no thunderbolt can compete with. Coming up next, we're going to explore how Aphrodite evolved through time, from Greek goddess to Roman icon, to Renaissance muse, to a planet in our night sky. Because even though the temples eventually fell, Aphrodite never really disappeared. Alright, so by now, you've seen just how present Aphrodite was in the ancient world. She wasn't a background character. She wasn't a symbol people occasionally referenced. She was everywhere, from sculpture to song, from temple rituals to battlefield dedications. She had her hands, gently, invisibly, in everything. But here's what's even more fascinating. Even after the Greek temples crumbled, even after Rome fell, even after Christianity spread across Europe and gods like Zeus and Hera were labeled as myths or forgotten entirely, Aphrodite didn't fade away, she adapted. Let's talk about how the first major shift happened in Rome. As we mentioned earlier, the Romans adopted Aphrodite and renamed her Venus. But this wasn't just a name change, it was a rebranding, a cultural repositioning. The Romans weren't just interested in beauty, they wanted power, heritage, control, and Venus became a tool for all three. Julius Caesar, probably the most powerful Roman in history, claimed his family descended from Venus through her son Aeneas. That claim wasn't just religious, it was political. It said, "I'm not just a ruler, I'm divine. My bloodline is sanctioned by a goddess." That idea got passed down. Emperors kept referencing Venus to legitimize their reigns. Temples to her were built in central public spaces. Venus became less about intimate love and more about empire, legacy, and dominance. In art, Venus was depicted not as an aloof goddess, but as Rome's mother, protective, regal, almost nationalistic. This is where you start seeing the duality of her image, soft in myth, powerful in symbol, and that duality carried forward, especially during the Renaissance. Fast forward a few centuries. It's the 1400s. Europe is rediscovering ancient Greek and Roman art, literature, and philosophy. The Renaissance begins, and with it, a massive cultural rebirth. Painters, poets, and sculptors turn to the old gods for inspiration, and guess who comes back into the spotlight? Venus, Aphrodite. One of the most iconic paintings in all of Western art is Botticelli's The Birth of Venus. You've probably seen it, even if you don't realize it. A tall, graceful woman standing on a giant seashell floating to shore, her long hair swirling around her. She's partially covered, surrounded by the wind, flowers, and gentle waves. It's not just a painting, it's a cultural reset. Botticelli isn't painting just any goddess. He's painting the goddess, the embodiment of beauty itself, and he's doing it in a time when Europe is still struggling between strict religious rules and the rediscovery of human emotion, sensuality, and expression. Venus becomes a symbol of balance. She represents the idea that beauty isn't sinful, that it can elevate the soul, inspire creativity, move people closer to truth. And from that moment on, artists couldn't get enough of her. Titian paints her lounging, Rubens paints her surrounded by cherubs. Sculptors carve her in marble, poets write odes to her, musicians reference her in lyrics. Every medium wants a piece of Aphrodite, and what's interesting is that each generation reshapes her, just a little. In the Renaissance, she's grace. In the Romantic era, she's longing. In the modern era, she becomes a blend, power and vulnerability, seduction and sorrow. Even science got involved. In 1610, Galileo points his telescope at the night sky and observes the planet we now call Venus. It shines bright in the early evening, and just before dawn, what we now call the evening star or morning star. Ancient people already knew about it, of course, but giving it the name Venus solidified something, that even in space this goddess had a place. Today Venus is one of the brightest objects in the night sky, and even now, when astronomers track weather patterns on its hellish surface, acid clouds, crushing pressure, the name still sticks. Why? Because Aphrodite's power wasn't about facts. It was about feelings, memory, influence. And you can't erase that by changing your religion or building new systems. Once a name like that is planted in culture, it grows on its own. And let's not forget language. We still use the term aphrodisiac, meaning something that stirs desire, directly from her name. We still associate doves, roses, scallop shells, and swans with love, because of her symbols. We still build Valentine's Day around heart imagery, attraction, and love poetry. Rituals that mirror the kind of offerings ancient Greeks made to her in temple courtyards. We don't call it Aphrodite anymore, but it is her. Just updated, rebranded, modernized. She's in film, characters modeled after her archetype, alluring, mysterious, misunderstood. She's in fashion, the idealized forms that are praised, questioned, imitated. She's in psychology, studies about love, attraction, beauty standards. And maybe most importantly, she's in how we talk about connection. When someone says there was chemistry, that's Aphrodite. When someone lights a candle and puts on soft music before a date, that's Aphrodite. When someone gets overwhelmed by love, the messy, confusing, heart-wrenching kind, and wonders what's wrong with them, that too is Aphrodite. Because here's the truth. You can take away her temples, you can rename her, you can ignore the myths. But as long as people still fall in love, as long as they still crave connection, she's still around, and that's what makes her different from other gods. Zeus ruled the sky, Poseidon ruled the sea, Hades ruled the dead. But Aphrodite, she ruled people, from the inside. And no empire, no religion, no amount of modern progress has ever fully escaped her reach, So we've talked about how Aphrodite became Venus, how she was used by emperors like Julius Caesar to craft divine bloodlines, and how she resurfaced during the Renaissance as a muse for some of the most iconic paintings in Western history. But let's stretch this idea even further, because Aphrodite's evolution didn't stop there. In fact, her image started to fracture, branching out into different archetypes. Depending on the culture and time period, she became a mother, a temptress, a protector, a cautionary tale, a fashion icon, or a symbol of inner power. Let's start with the Renaissance Venus, and what she really stood for. It's easy to look at Botticelli's Birth of Venus, and just see a pretty woman on a seashell, but that painting had layers. To Renaissance thinkers, it wasn't just about beauty, it was about rebirth, both literal and philosophical. Venus rising from the sea symbolized the reawakening of culture, of ideas, of human emotion. After the long silence of the medieval era, her arrival wasn't just physical, it was intellectual. She was love, yes, but also enlightenment, creative energy, emotional freedom, a response to centuries of rigid systems and dogma. And that's why Venus started appearing everywhere in Renaissance art. She wasn't threatening, she wasn't aggressive, she was vulnerable and open. The embodiment of natural beauty. The kind that doesn't demand attention but gets it anyway. The kind that inspires artists to spend years trying to capture a single curve or shadow. Later, during the Baroque period, the image of Aphrodite, still called Venus by this point, got more dramatic. Painters like Rubens took that softness and gave it volume. Their Venuses were fleshy, glowing, and surrounded by rich drapery, cherubs, and golden light. These images weren't subtle. They celebrated abundance, fertility, the raw, almost chaotic power of attraction. This version of Venus, lush, indulgent, larger than life, was meant to overwhelm the senses, to say this is what love feels like, big, unavoidable. Then came the neoclassical era, where artists tried to clean up her image. Sculptures became symmetrical, paintings became more restrained. Venus was now shown with a calm expression, a soft gaze, and a body shaped like a marble statue, flawless but distant. Emotion was dialed down, ideal beauty was emphasized, and that idea, that beauty must be perfect and composed, stuck around for centuries. It's one of the reasons modern beauty standards exist at all. Aphrodite's form, stylized and idealized through sculpture and painting, quietly became the template for how femininity should be seen. Now let's pause for a second and really think about that. A myth from 2000 plus years ago ended up shaping magazine covers in the 20th century, and not just visuals. Aphrodite influenced the language of romance and desire. The word aphrodisiac, as mentioned earlier, is directly taken from her name. It refers to anything that enhances attraction or sensuality. But think beyond that. Words like venereal, as in venereal disease, are based on Venus's name. Why? Because for centuries, she was the umbrella under which anything involving love, desire, or physical connection was categorized. For better or worse, even today, astrology still links Venus to love and pleasure. If someone says Venus is in retrograde, they're usually blaming the chaos in their love life on the symbolic movements of this ancient goddess. Now, whether or not you believe in astrology, it doesn't really matter here. What matters is that she's still part of the conversation, and not just in spiritual communities. In fashion, for example, the name Venus has been used for everything from perfume brands to designer lines. The scallop shell, her signature arrival symbol, appears in logos, runway designs, even bathroom decor. That single shell, meant to evoke a moment of mythical birth, now sits quietly in millions of homes, unrecognized. You'll also see her in film. Think of every movie character who shows up in slow motion, the hair flip, the background music, the stunned look from the people around her. That's Aphrodite. Or every love triangle where the entire plot hinges on one person being so desirable that everyone else loses their mind. Also her, manic pixie dream girl trope, the mysterious woman at the bar, the dreamlike figure that disappears into a crowd, leaving the main character breathless and confused, all echoes of her. And here's something a lot of people miss. Aphrodite's influence isn't limited to women. There are modern male characters built around the idea of the Aphrodite archetype, too, not because they're feminine, but because they're irresistible, charming, charismatic, magnetic without trying. Think of characters who walk into a room and the tone changes, not because they're loud or strong, but because everyone feels something when they arrive. Everyone reacts. Everyone adjusts. That's her energy, in a new shape. In psychology, the idea of a person who triggers strong desire or fixation is sometimes referred to as a Venus figure. Entire personality theories, especially those looking at archetypes, like Jungian psychology, include Aphrodite, or Venus as symbols of creativity, erotic power, and emotional disruption. Even modern therapy sometimes uses her stories as cautionary tales, as a way to explain how love, when unbalanced, can lead to obsession, destruction, or dependency. You'll see her in literature too. In romance novels, she's often the theme, even if she's never named. Every storyline where desire overrides logic, where attraction changes the path of a character's life, where two people fall for each other, and everything else falls apart. That's her fingerprint. She's in poetry, in lyrics, in advertising. She's in the rose petals, the red dresses, the candle-lit dinners. She's in breakup songs and wedding vows. And that's not a coincidence. That's what cultural immortality looks like. It's not about whether people still believe in you. It's about whether they behave like they do, even if they don't realize it. Aphrodite doesn't need temples anymore. She's survived far longer than most gods because she never relied on loyalty. She relied on emotion, on being the thing people feel, not the thing they worship out loud. And because of that, she's everywhere. But let's slow things down. Let's leave the grand temples for a moment. Let's step away from public festivals and battlefields. And instead, let's open the door to a small home in ancient Athens, or maybe a courtyard in Cyprus, or a shaded bedroom in Corinth. The kind of quiet space where real people, mostly women, lit small lamps, whispered simple prayers, and asked for things they didn't dare say aloud in public. Because Aphrodite wasn't just a symbol of empire or a name in the epics. She was also the one you turned to when your heart was aching, when your marriage was arranged but your feelings weren't, when you wanted children but couldn't conceive, when your husband was distant, when your lover was fading, when your youth was passing. She was the goddess you could speak to about all of that, without judgment. For many women in the ancient world, Aphrodite was the most personal of all the gods. Unlike Hera, who ruled over marriage and often punished disobedience, or Artemis, who demanded chastity and independence, Aphrodite didn't shame people for longing. She understood it, and that's what made her feel safe. In homes across the Greek and Roman world, small altars to Aphrodite could be found near mirrors, water basins, or among personal items like combs, oils, or jewelry. These weren't grand altars, no crowds, no sacrifice rituals, just a few flower petals, maybe a shell, a bit of perfume, sometimes a strand of hair offered quietly, delicately, with a whispered wish. Married women often prayed to Aphrodite Urania, the heavenly Aphrodite. This version was tied to deeper spiritual love, not lust. She was seen as the one who could smooth out tension between spouses, rekindle affection, bring emotional harmony. New brides would leave offerings on the night before their weddings, hoping the goddess would bless the union, ease anxiety, and bring joy to what was often a politically arranged match. Young girls, reaching maturity, would sometimes dedicate their childhood toys, dolls, ribbons, or even miniature mirrors, to Aphrodite as a rite of passage. These gestures marked their shift from childhood to womanhood. It was both symbolic and deeply emotional, saying goodbye to innocence and stepping into a world where beauty, attraction, and desire would soon define how others saw them. And when a woman became pregnant, or hoped to, she might place her hand on her belly and murmur a few words to Aphrodite, not for a painless birth. That was more Artemis's domain, but for connection, for bonding, for warmth between mother and child, for a love that would last even through hardship. Widows, too, prayed to her. Not for new love necessarily, but for comfort, for memories, for something soft to hold onto in the silence of grief. Even among men, devotion to Aphrodite wasn't unheard of. Sculptors often kept her image in their studios, not just as a reference for form, but as inspiration. Musicians would place small figures of her on the table as they wrote love songs. Poets might invoke her in the opening lines of their verses, hoping to channel her influence and stir emotion in readers and soldiers. Before leaving for war, some would ask Aphrodite to keep their wives or lovers safe, or to give them something worth returning to. That was one of her quieter powers, hope. She wasn't just about the moment of love, she was about its memory, its potential, its promise. And for that reason, many people kept their prayers to her private. They didn't announce them. They didn't boast about them. They didn't always go to the temple. They just lit a small flame, left a flower, whispered a name, and hoped she was listening. Now this kind of personal worship, this intimacy, is often forgotten in historical records. Ancient historians loved writing about temples, wars, and public ceremonies, but they didn't always care about the woman in a quiet village who lit a lamp at twilight and whispered, "Please let him love me back." But those are the moments that sustained Aphrodite's power, because gods, no matter how grand, only survive if people keep talking to them. And people did talk to her, constantly, in every corner of life. There are also records, archaeological and written, of small figurines and charms being carried in pockets or worn on cords under clothing, many of them shaped like doves, hearts, or miniature seashells. Some were made of bronze or clay, others, if someone had money, were carved from ivory or decorated with gemstones. These weren't fashion pieces, they were protection. Tiny tokens meant to attract love, ward off jealousy, or calm the heart of someone going through loss or loneliness. Some were even buried with the dead, placed in graves alongside other offerings, in the hope that Aphrodite's gentle influence would follow someone into the afterlife, not to ignite passion, but to bring peace. In Rome, this practice continued under the name of Venus. Wealthier homes sometimes had full household shrines, complete with incense dishes, paintings, and sculpted figures. But even in smaller apartments, a simple pendant on a wall or a charm near a mirror told you everything you needed to know. She was still there, still being whispered to, still being trusted. And that level of closeness, that's something very few gods ever achieve. Because it wasn't built on fear or awe, it was built on understanding. Aphrodite knew what people wanted, even when they couldn't say it out loud. And so in those moments when people were most vulnerable, right before a first kiss, right after heartbreak, right when a marriage felt like it was falling apart, they didn't turn to thunder gods or warriors, they turned to her. Not because she fixed everything, but because she felt it with them. And that's what made her eternal. That's what made her. By now, we've followed Aphrodite through 1,000 years of history. We've walked through her myths, her chaotic origins, her entanglements with gods and mortals, her interference in wars, her romantic alliances, her moments of cruelty, her gestures of grace. We've seen how she was worshipped in temples, whispered to in bedrooms, and reimagined in painting and sculpture centuries after her name faded from official religion. But there's a bigger picture forming now. Because when you put all of these stories, traditions, and rituals side by side, you start to see something. Aphrodite was never just about beauty, never just about love. She was about us. She was about the contradictions that define people, the chaos that comes with wanting something so badly it blinds you, the peace that comes from being close to someone you trust, the thrill of attention, the fear of rejection, the strength it takes to let someone in, and the vulnerability that follows. Her mythology wasn't consistent, and maybe that's the point. One story paints her as a force of nature, born from the sea in a moment of divine violence. Another gives her a more traditional divine parentage, as the daughter of Zeus and Dione. Some myths show her as vengeful, punishing mortals who defy her. Others show her deeply human, weeping over Adonis, wounded on the battlefield, humiliated in front of the gods. In one moment, she's seducing a shepherd to produce a founder of empires. In the next, she's helping a sculptor's lonely dream come to life. She's generous, she's petty, she's divine, she's personal. And that inconsistency, that's not a flaw in her story, that is her story. Because love, real love, isn't clean, it isn't predictable, it isn't safe. It changes, it stumbles, it contradicts itself. And Aphrodite, in every version of her myth, reflects that. The Greeks, knowingly or not, built a goddess who mirrored their deepest emotions. They made her powerful, because love changes fate. They made her feared, because love unravels logic. They made her beautiful, because desire commands attention. And they made her flawed, because everyone who's ever loved knows it comes with pain. That's why she lasted. Because she didn't offer a perfect version of love. She was love, in all its strange, messy, powerful forms. Even her symbols tell that story. The dove, for instance, isn't just a soft, beautiful bird. Doves mate for life. They're affectionate, loyal, but they're also fragile. And once separated from a partner, some doves will grieve for days. That's Aphrodite. The rose, another of her symbols, is beautiful but guarded. Its scent is sweet, its petals delicate, but it has thorns. You don't get one without the other. Even the scallop shell, the symbol of her birth, is a contradiction. It's protective on the outside, yet soft and vulnerable on the inside. And it hides beauty, a pearl, maybe, or something divine. Beneath its surface, every symbol attached to her contains both attraction and danger, warmth and risk. That's what love is. And that's why Aphrodite, more than perhaps any other deity in the Greek pantheon, remained relevant long after belief in the gods faded. Because even when people stopped believing in the literal gods, they never stopped believing in the things those gods represented. People still fell in love, still longed for connection, still mourned heartbreak, still made art to impress someone, still dressed up to feel desirable, still stared out windows and wondered if the person they loved would ever feel the same. And every one of those moments belonged to Aphrodite. She just changed outfits. In modern times, you'll still see versions of her everywhere. In psychology, she shows up as the archetype of the lover, the one who creates beauty, fosters intimacy, inspires others, but is also prone to being wounded, to feeling too much, to losing herself in others. In pop culture, she's in songs about heartbreak and euphoria. She's in perfume ads, in dating apps, in the character who says, "I don't know why I keep falling for the wrong person." She's in self-help books about learning to love yourself again, in stories about betrayal, in tattoos that say love never dies. She's in all of it. And no other ancient goddess has made that kind of journey, from sacred temples to background apps, from marble statues to Instagram filters, from ocean foam to cultural DNA. Because while people outgrew the rituals, they never outgrew her. Why? Because at the end of the day, we're all still trying to understand the same things the Greeks were wrestling with thousands of years ago. Why do we fall for people who hurt us? Why does rejection sting so much? Why does beauty feel like power? Why does desire make us irrational? Why do we remember love, even when it's long gone? Aphrodite didn't answer those questions. She was the answer, not the solution, but the embodiment. The name people gave to that ache in their chest when they missed someone, or that spark in their stomach when someone looked at them just a little too long. She's not just a figure from myth. She's a mirror, and every time someone looks into that mirror and sees something they don't fully understand, they're not alone. They're looking into the same mystery that captivated poets, painters, philosophers, and shepherds long before us. And long after we're gone, that mirror will still be there, reflecting someone else's heartbreak, someone else's joy, someone else's hope. That's Aphrodite. When we hear about Aphrodite, we usually hear the highlights, the beauty, the birth from the sea, the love affairs, the war she indirectly caused, the statues, the roses, the doves. But there's another layer that rarely gets explored: what people, gods, and even poets really thought of her. Not what they said to her face, but what they said behind it, how they described her power, how they tried to explain her influence when things went wrong, how they respected her and resented her at the same time. Let's start with the gods. Most of them didn't trust her, not because she was evil, but because she couldn't be predicted. You never really knew where you stood with Aphrodite. One moment, she's blessing your marriage. The next, she's making your wife fall in love with someone else. Not through curses, not through rage, just gently tilting things until chaos becomes inevitable. To the gods of Olympus, gods who loved control, structure, hierarchy, Aphrodite was a problem. Hera, queen of the gods, was particularly vocal. As goddess of marriage and family, Hera was always cleaning up messes Aphrodite helped cause, and she couldn't punish her directly. Aphrodite was too beloved by Zeus, and too woven into divine society to be openly challenged. But the tension was always there. In myths, Hera is often portrayed as suspicious of her, wary of her charms, her motives, her presence at divine councils. She didn't like that Aphrodite could walk into any room and shift the energy without raising her voice. Hera ruled by status. Aphrodite ruled by attraction. Two different types of power, one formal, the other unstoppable. Athena, the goddess of wisdom and war, wasn't a fan either. She valued logic, restraint, discipline. Aphrodite was none of those things. Where Athena calculated, Aphrodite felt. Athena believed love got in the way of rational thinking. Aphrodite believed love was the only thing worth thinking about. It made them fundamentally incompatible. They often backed opposing heroes. Athena supported Odysseus, cunning, clever, emotionally detached. Aphrodite supported Paris and Aeneas, driven by emotion, loyalty, and passion. Even Artemis, the chaste goddess of the hunt, stayed clear of Aphrodite's world. Their domains didn't overlap much, but when they did, it usually ended in disaster. To Artemis, love made people weak. To Aphrodite, love made people human. Their values clashed. Their silence around each other was telling. Hephaestus, Aphrodite's husband, had a different perspective. His view of her wasn't shaped by mythic archetypes or divine politics. It was personal. He loved her, but he also knew she didn't love him. That kind of imbalance is hard to live with, especially when everyone knows he wasn't the attractive one. He wasn't exciting. He was kind, stable, intelligent, but next to the goddess of desire, he was invisible, and he knew it. His resentment didn't make him cruel, but it made him hurt. And in a myth where he catches her and Ares in a golden net, paraded in front of the gods, it's hard to ignore the emotion behind it. He wasn't trying to punish her, he was trying to be seen. Hera's acknowledged. That myth is often told for comedy, but if you slow it down and look at what's really happening, it's heartbreak. It's the pain of someone who loved too deeply and wasn't loved back. Then there was Ares, the god of war. Their relationship was passion, no pretense, no compromise, just intensity. They were physical opposites, war and love, but emotionally they made sense. Ares didn't try to control her. He admired her, respected her independence. They shared power rather than competing for it. To outsiders, their relationship looked volatile, but in reality, it was one of the few pairings in Olympus where both sides knew exactly what they were getting into. No lies, no illusions. Now let's talk about how mortals saw her, because the stories they told about Aphrodite were more complicated. Some prayed to her in secret, others blamed her for their suffering. Many myths show mortals pushed to the edge by her influence. Take the story of Phaedra, Hippolytus's stepmother. She was consumed by a love she didn't ask for, a love Aphrodite planted in her heart because Hippolytus disrespected her. It wasn't fair, but it was final. Phaedra's perspective is often left out. She didn't want to fall in love with her stepson. She tried to fight it, tried to hide it, but the weight of it, the emotional violence of feeling something you can't control, crushed her. Then there's Myrrha, the tragic figure who was cursed by Aphrodite, according to some versions, to fall in love with her own father. Again, not a curse out of malice, a curse born of balance. Mira's mother boasted that her daughter was more beautiful than the goddess of love herself. And that's a recurring theme in Aphrodite's stories. People claiming they're above love, that they're smarter than it, better than it, immune to it. And Aphrodite's answer is always the same: no, you're not. Because you can't outthink emotion, you can't avoid desire forever, and when you try to deny it completely, it finds you anyway, usually in a way that breaks you open. That's the fear mortals had around Aphrodite, not that she would strike you down, but that she would expose you, reveal what you wanted most, even if you didn't know it yet. And for a society built on appearances, structure and control, that was terrifying. And yet despite that fear, or maybe because of it, they kept building her temples, kept offering her incense, kept whispering her name, because deep down they knew something we still wrestle with today. You can't control love, but maybe if you're lucky you can ask for mercy from the one who does, from the one who... Aphrodite wasn't just a goddess who influenced others, she also had a family of her own, and just like everything else in her mythology, it wasn't simple. Some of her children were born from passion, others from divine unions arranged by fate. Some came from her romantic entanglements with other gods, while others seem more like extensions of her nature than literal offspring. But if you really look closely, every one of her children, real or symbolic, represents a piece of her, a different facet of what it means to feel deeply, to love, to want, to lose. Let's start with the most famous of them all, Eros, the god of desire, also known more popularly as Cupid in Roman mythology. But don't let the baby wings and cartoon arrows fool you. The original Eros wasn't soft, he wasn't innocent, he wasn't silly. In the oldest versions of the myth, Eros was a primal force, one of the first gods to exist, a being that embodied the concept of attraction, the gravitational pull between two souls, not sexual in a crude way, but fundamental, magnetic, cosmic. Some myths say Eros existed before Aphrodite, that he helped shape the world itself through the power of union. Others, especially later versions, describe him as Aphrodite's son, born from her union with Ares, the god of war. And if that's true, if Eros is the product of love and war, then his very existence is a symbol that desire can be beautiful, but also dangerous, that it can bind people or destroy them. Eros wasn't just about making people fall in love, he was about control. He carried two kinds of arrows, one tipped with gold, to inspire love, one tipped with lead, to inspire rejection. So yes, he could make you fall in love with someone at first sight, but he could also make you repulsed by someone you once cared for. And Aphrodite, she used him like a scalpel. In many myths she sends Eros to stir desire in mortals and gods alike, as a weapon, as a gift, as a test. He acts on her behalf, silently, invisibly. You don't know he's there until your feelings change, and once he strikes there's no undoing it. Now let's talk about Harmonia, one of the lesser-known daughters of Aphrodite and Ares. While her parents represented chaos and passion, Harmonia was, as her name suggests, the opposite. She stood for balance, unity, the emotional calm that follows after stormy romance. In myth, Harmonia marries Cadmus, the founder of Thebes. Their wedding was grand, attended by gods and mortals alike. But here's where things turn again, in true Greek fashion. At her wedding she receives a necklace, a cursed one, created by Hephaestus out of jealousy. This necklace brings disaster to her descendants. Her children and grandchildren face betrayals, madness, and tragic ends. It's another reminder that even harmony, when touched by divine conflict, can't escape pain. Still, Harmonia's existence shows a deeper side of Aphrodite. She wasn't just about fiery love, she also represented peace, the deep, quiet connection that forms over time, the kind of love that doesn't dazzle but endures. Then we have Phobos and Deimos, meaning fear and terror. These two were also sons of Aphrodite and Ares. Their names might not sound romantic, but they matter, because they represent what love often walks alongside: anxiety, the fear of losing someone, the terror of not being enough, the panic of rejection, the dark side of desire. Phobos and Deimos were often seen accompanying their father Ares on the battlefield, causing confusion and dread among enemies. But from another angle, they're a psychological truth, because even in the most passionate love, fear is never far behind. Then there's Anteros, sometimes described as the god of requited love. He was said to be the brother of Eros, and his existence had a beautiful logic behind it. According to one myth, Eros wasn't growing properly. He remained small, weak, immature. Aphrodite was worried. The gods told her love, to grow, must be returned. So she bore Anteros, the god of mutual love, the reflection, the answer to desire. And when Anteros arrived, Eros began to grow. It's a simple myth, but it says something profound. Love can't survive on its own. It needs to be fed, returned, shared. Unrequited love. That's Eros alone. Strong but lonely. Mutual love. That's Eros and Anteros together. Balanced, supported. Now let's move to Hermaphroditus, the child of Aphrodite and Hermes. Hermaphroditus was born as a beautiful boy, raised in the forests by nymphs. One day, a nymph named Salmacis fell in love with him. But unlike most stories where love is mutual, this one wasn't. Hermaphroditus rejected her advances, but she wouldn't let go. She prayed to the gods that they would never be separated, and the gods, perhaps listening too literally, merged them into one being, both male and female. Hermaphroditus became a symbol of duality, unity, blended identity, not just gender, but emotional wholeness, a fusion of opposites. And through him, Aphrodite's influence stretched even further, into conversations about what it means to be whole, to contain both strength and softness, desire and refusal, clarity and confusion. All of her children, Eros, Harmonia, Phobos, Deimos, Anteros, Hermaphroditus, represent emotions we all carry. He didn't birth gods of harvest or sea. She birthed gods of feeling, because she herself wasn't tied to any one place or power. She was emotion, and her children, each one of them, expanded the emotional spectrum she ruled over. They filled in the blanks, took her chaos, and shaped it into names, faces, symbols, and in doing so, they made her legacy even harder to escape. Because you can avoid a temple, you can stop praying, you can laugh at mythology, but you can't stop feeling. And as long as humans continue to love, fear, long or dream, Aphrodite's lineage continues. If you wanted to recognize Aphrodite, you didn't need to see her face, you didn't need to hear her voice, or feel the warmth of her skin, or see her rise from the sea. You could recognize her in the objects she left behind. A petal, a feather, a faint scent on a breeze. Because Aphrodite didn't just exist in myths and temples, she existed in symbols, in things people could touch, hold, wear, offer. These were the everyday reminders that she was near. Let's start with the one you've probably seen the most. The dove. In modern times we associate doves with peace, but in the ancient world, they were unmistakably tied to Aphrodite. If you saw a dove circling above a temple, or resting on a rooftop near an altar, you didn't wonder, you knew. Doves were gentle, affectionate birds. They mated for life. They cooed softly, and often traveled in pairs. To the ancients they weren't just animals, they were a symbol of emotional bonding, of loyalty, of soft companionship. In many depictions, Aphrodite rides in a golden chariot pulled by doves. Not horses, not lions, not dragons, doves. It's a detail that says everything. She didn't need strength to be powerful. She didn't need speed or fire, or flight. Her power came softly, subtly, and everyone followed anyway. Offerings of doves, either live or in symbolic form, were often made in her temples. Some regions even believed that white doves were sacred to her and allowed them to live undisturbed around shrines. And when a couple brought doves as part of a wedding offering, they weren't just giving birds, they were saying, "Let our bond be like this, gentle, loyal, enduring." Now let's talk about roses. Not just any flower, the rose. By the Roman period, the rose had become Aphrodite's most recognizable floral symbol, and not just because it was beautiful. Roses were complex. They grew in tangled vines, opened slowly, and often came with thorns that mattered. Aphrodite wasn't just about beauty, she was about the cost of beauty, the risk, the vulnerability, and roses captured that duality perfectly. According to some legends, red roses sprang from the ground where Adonis bled and Aphrodite's tears fell. So the color red, not just passion, but grief, became part of her floral vocabulary. People would scatter rose petals at her altars, women would weave them into their hair, lovers would exchange them quietly, and poets, they obsessed over them. To give someone a rose in the ancient world wasn't just romantic, it was spiritual. It meant you were invoking the goddess herself, asking her to watch over the connection. Then there's myrtle. Myrtle isn't flashy, it doesn't make it into modern perfume ads. But in Aphrodite's time, it was just as important as the rose. The plant has small white or pink blossoms, and a rich green color. It was seen as a plant of protection, fertility, and devotion. It often grew near coastal areas, where Aphrodite herself was said to have first walked ashore. Brides wore myrtle crowns during wedding ceremonies. They planted it in gardens as a blessing for harmony in the household. Some temples even had myrtle groves where people could go to pray privately, away from public rituals. And that's key, because Aphrodite wasn't always worshipped with noise. Sometimes it was the silence of a single flower, placed beside a mirror, that meant the most. Speaking of mirrors, the mirror was one of her core symbols, not for vanity. That's a modern misinterpretation. The mirror, in Aphrodite's mythology, symbolized awareness, to see oneself, to recognize beauty, to confront truth. It wasn't about being obsessed with your reflection, it was about understanding the power of it. Because beauty, especially in a world ruled by appearances and alliances, was dangerous. It could be currency, it could be punishment. And the mirror reminded people that Aphrodite's power didn't lie in what she looked like, but in how people looked at each other because of her. That subtle shift, where attention turns to desire, that's the mirror's domain. People would place polished bronze or silver mirrors on her altars, not to gaze at themselves, but to reflect her presence, to invite clarity, or to ask, let me be seen as beautiful in someone's eyes. It was a personal kind of prayer. Another symbol, the scallop shell. We've talked about this already, especially in Botticelli's Birth of Venus. But let's go deeper. The scallop shell is more than a prop. It's a metaphor, hard on the outside, protective, defensive, soft and vulnerable inside. The shell represents the tension between exposure and protection, something Aphrodite knew all too well. She was worshipped for her openness, her sensuality, her emotional power, but she was also frequently mocked, shamed, and used as a scapegoat. The shell became a quiet emblem of all those who carried beauty with caution, and for that reason, women often used shells in bathing rituals dedicated to her, as tools, offerings, or symbols of personal renewal. Then there's the apple, not just any apple, the golden apple. This takes us back to the myth of the Judgment of Paris, where Aphrodite, Hera, and Athena compete for the title of the fairest. Paris awards the golden apple to Aphrodite, and in doing so triggers the Trojan War. The apple came to represent not just beauty, but choice, decision, the kind of pivotal moment that changes everything. And for centuries afterward, apples remain symbols of love, temptation, and destiny, especially when given as gifts. In some regions, tossing an apple at someone was a way to say, I love you. Simple, direct, pure Aphrodite. Even swans, elegant, quiet, gliding across lakes, became hers. They mate for life. They mourn when separated. They represent grace in motion. In art, Aphrodite is often shown with swans beside her, or riding a swan-drawn chariot in Roman mosaics. They aren't loud or flashy. They just exist in a kind of effortless beauty, which is exactly what she inspired. Each of these symbols, dove, rose, myrtle, mirror, shell, apple, swan, carried meaning far beyond their shape or scent. They were the language of Aphrodite, not spoken, not sung, just felt. And that's how her worship spread, not through conquest or commandments, but through repetition, through flowers planted in spring, through gifts passed between lovers, through the touch of a comb, the scent of a bloom, the reflection in a pool of water. You didn't need to say her name, you just had to feel something, and then do something to honor it. And even today, those gestures continue. A rose on a first date, a mirror before a night out, a necklace with a scallop shell pendant, a white dove released at a wedding, a heart-shaped apple in a love story. They may not be seen as religious anymore, but they're still rituals, still acts of belief, still small, everyday offerings to a goddess who never really left. Aphrodite didn't seek out enemies. She didn't raise armies. She didn't throw lightning. She wasn't a conqueror in the traditional sense. But despite that, or maybe because of that, she had more rivals than you might expect, not because she attacked them, but because her influence was everywhere, and not everyone welcomed it. Some gods, and some mortals tried to resist her, to live without love, without longing, without the complications she brought into every room she entered, and to her, that wasn't just rejection, it was an insult. Let's begin with the divine. Among the Olympians, we've already seen that Hera, Athena, and Artemis all had issues with her, but each for very different reasons. Hera, as queen of the gods, ruled over marriage and family. On paper, she should have worked closely with Aphrodite, but in practice, their domains constantly collided. Aphrodite dealt with desire, which often preceded marriage, or in many cases disrupted it. How many unions did Aphrodite complicate? How many wives saw their husbands fall for someone else because of her influence? And Hera, who already struggled with Zeus's constant infidelity, wasn't exactly forgiving when it came to love goddesses, who stirred up chaos, even unintentionally. Their rivalry simmered beneath the surface. Hera represented structure, Aphrodite, disruption. You could almost see it as two different types of love. Hera's was contractual, a sacred bond between husband and wife, rooted in tradition. Aphrodite's was emotional, unpredictable, overwhelming, instinctive. They couldn't agree. They weren't designed to. Athena, on the other hand, rejected Aphrodite outright. She was a virgin goddess, not in the sense of never being wanted, but in the sense of choosing not to want. She valued clarity, control, and intelligence. Emotions clouded judgment. Attraction created weakness. To Athena, Aphrodite was the embodiment of vulnerability, something she had trained her entire life to avoid. And that's why they rarely appear in the same myth. They weren't enemies in battle, they were opposites in philosophy. Each represented a different way to be powerful. Athena calculated, reserved, strategic. Aphrodite, emotional, instinctual, untamable. They both worked, they both influenced the world, but they could never truly coexist. Then there's Artemis, the wild huntress, the protector of women and girls, the one who lived free of male attention and emotional dependency. Her world was forests, arrows, moonlight. Aphrodite's world was bedsheets, mirrors and roses. They never fought openly, but when their stories crossed, like in the tale of Hippolytus, the results were tragic. Artemis protected Hippolytus because he honored her vow of chastity. Aphrodite punished him for refusing her power. Two goddesses, two belief systems, neither backing down, and in the end the mortal caught between them was destroyed. But Aphrodite's most dangerous rivalries weren't with gods, they were with mortals, because mortals, unlike gods, were vulnerable to her influence. Yet some tried to resist anyway, and those who did, rarely escaped unscathed. Let's start with Psyche. Psyche wasn't a goddess, she was just a mortal woman, a princess, beautiful beyond comparison. Too beautiful, in fact. According to the myth, people started worshipping her, instead of Aphrodite. They left the goddess's temples empty, and brought their offerings to this mortal girl. That was enough to spark jealousy. Aphrodite didn't just want to punish Psyche, she wanted to break her, so she summoned her son Eros, and ordered him to make Psyche fall in love with the ugliest man alive. But fate, or something deeper, intervened. Eros saw Psyche, and fell in love himself. He disobeyed his mother. He took Psyche away, secretly, and hid her in a magical palace. But there was a catch. She could never see his face. Their love had to remain blind, hidden, and for a time it worked, until Psyche, filled with doubt, lit a lamp one night while Eros slept. She saw him, realized who he was, and he vanished. What follows is one of the most brutal trials in mythology. Aphrodite, enraged by the betrayal, forces Psyche to complete a series of impossible tasks, sorting endless seeds, retrieving deadly wool, collecting water from the underworld, each task more hopeless than the last. And yet, Psyche survives, not through strength, not through divine favor, but through patience, willpower, quiet endurance. In the end, the gods intervene. Psyche is granted immortality. She reunites with Eros. Aphrodite, unwilling to continue the fight, accepts the union. And in that story, we see something rare. A mortal wins, not by overpowering the goddess of love, but by understanding what love requires: effort, risk, pain, trust. Psyche's name, by the way, it means soul. So the tale of Eros and Psyche isn't just a love story, It's a metaphor. Desire alone isn't enough. The soul must grow to meet it. Then there's Myrrha, who we touched on earlier. Aphrodite cursed her. Some say in response to hubris, others say out of anger from a family insult. Either way, the result was devastating. Myrrha was made to fall in love with her own father. She disguised herself, slept with him, and when the truth came out, she fled, pregnant, ashamed, broken. The gods transformed her into a myrrha tree, and from that tree was born Adonis, Aphrodite's greatest mortal love. So even in punishment, Aphrodite's story coils back into itself. Her rival's suffering creates her future lover, and Adonis, his own fate is tragic. He dies young, gored by a boar, bleeding in Aphrodite's arms. From his blood, red flowers grow. Even Aphrodite's victories come at a cost. Another tale. Atalanta, a fierce, independent woman, a hunter, a warrior. She refused to marry, unless a man could beat her in a foot race. Anyone who lost would be executed. Dozens tried, all failed. Then came Hippomenes, but he had a secret weapon, Aphrodite. He prayed to the goddess for help, and she gave him 3 golden apples from her sacred grove. During the race, Hippomenes threw the apples one by one. Atalanta, curious, slowed to pick each one up, and that was enough. He won. They married, but they forgot to thank Aphrodite. Later, consumed by passion in a sacred temple, they broke a vow of respect, and were turned into lions. Lesson: even if you accept Aphrodite's help, you'd better not forget her. So whether they fought her, ignored her, or relied on her, mortals who crossed paths with Aphrodite always came away changed, because she wasn't a goddess you could ignore. If you resisted her, she reminded you why she mattered. If you accepted her, she tested your devotion. If you forgot her, she corrected you. Her power wasn't in punishment. It was in presence, unavoidable, undeniable, unrelenting. When people think of Aphrodite, they usually picture beginnings, the first glance, the first touch, the moment when love sparks and changes everything. But that's only half the story, because where there is love, real love, there is always the possibility of loss. And Aphrodite knew that. She wasn't just the goddess of desire, she was the goddess of what remains when desire fades, of what lingers after the goodbye, of the ache that love leaves behind. No myth shows this more clearly than the story of Adonis. We've touched on it already, but now, let's really sit with it. Adonis wasn't a god, he was a mortal, a beautiful young man, so beautiful, in fact, that even Aphrodite, the goddess of beauty itself, was captivated. According to the myth, she found him as a child, either born from a myrrh tree after his mother Myrrha was cursed, or discovered by chance. Either way, she raised him, protected him, watched him grow, and then, something shifted. He became not just someone she loved, but someone she couldn't imagine losing. There was a softness in their bond. Unlike her fiery affairs with Ares or her playful liaisons with mortals, her connection to Adonis was different. It was tender, emotional, deep, but it wasn't without conflict. Persephone, queen of the underworld, also fell in love with him, or at least wanted to keep him for herself. Depending on the version you read, either Aphrodite entrusted Adonis to Persephone's care and regretted it, or they both claimed him at the same time. Eventually, Zeus stepped in, trying, once again, to mediate the fallout of divine emotions. He decreed that Adonis would spend 1/3 of the year with Aphrodite, 1/3 with Persephone, and 1/3 wherever he pleased. But before that cycle could truly begin, something happened. Adonis went hunting. Aphrodite begged him not to go. She warned him, not with thunder or fire, but with a quiet desperation that only someone in love can feel. She had a premonition, a sense, a knowing, but Adonis went anyway, and while tracking a wild boar, he was gored, fatally. Some say the boar was sent by Ares, jealous of the attention Aphrodite gave Adonis. Others say it was a random act, a moment of nature's cruelty. Either way, it ended the same. Aphrodite, sensing the tragedy, rushed to his side. She found him bleeding, broken, dying. She knelt in the dirt, held him, wept, and from her tears and his blood, the anemone flower grew, delicate, redder, fragile. A reminder, in that moment, Aphrodite wasn't a goddess of seduction. She wasn't distant, ethereal, untouchable. She was grief, pure, undiluted grief. the kind that doesn't scream or rage, but just sits with the loss. And in that story, we see something profound, that even the most powerful goddess, the one who could make anyone fall in love, couldn't stop death, couldn't prevent heartbreak, couldn't hold on to the person she loved most. That story became the basis for a real-world tradition, the Adonia, a festival held by women, often in private. They would plant fast-sprouting herbs, lettuce, parsley, in small pots, watch them bloom quickly, and just as quickly, wither and die. It wasn't a celebration, it was a mourning ritual, not grand or public like other festivals, but personal, quiet, real, because every woman who had loved and lost, or who feared losing, saw herself in Aphrodite during the Adonia. And that's the version of her that people don't talk about enough. The after version, when the flowers fade, when the room is quiet, when there's nothing left to say except, I wish I had more time. In modern storytelling, love is often treated like a finish line. You meet someone, fall in love, roll credits. But real love doesn't end, it just changes. Sometimes it deepens, sometimes it breaks. And Aphrodite held space for both of those truths. That's why she wasn't only worshipped by brides and lovers, she was also whispered to by widows, by parents who had lost children, by soldiers who left behind partners, by anyone who had known what it meant to love something that couldn't last. She wasn't just a goddess of joy, she was a goddess of memory, of holding on, of lighting a small lamp at night for someone who isn't coming home, and still saying their name anyway. And in that she offered comfort, not a solution, not a miracle, but a presence, a reminder that grief too is a form of love, that mourning isn't weakness, it's devotion, that pain is proof that what you felt was real. So yes, Aphrodite caused heartbreak. She stirred chaos. She introduced emotions people didn't know how to handle, but she also stayed with them when it hurt. She didn't run from the aftermath. She was the aftermath. And in that role she became something more than a goddess of beauty. She became the keeper of emotional truth. Of all the gods in Olympus, she's the one who felt the most like a person, because we've all been there, holding on to something we can't keep, remembering something that changed us, grieving, and still loving through the grief. Let's talk about something that never really gets left behind when we discuss Aphrodite, her image, not her personality, not her stories, her appearance, because for thousands of years that's what most people latched onto first, and why wouldn't they? She was the goddess of beauty, literally, but what did that mean? And more importantly, what did it do to everyone who wasn't her? To understand that, we have to go back to the basics. Aphrodite, especially in Greek mythology, was described as irresistibly beautiful, no flaws, no imperfections, no equal, so beautiful that mortals worshipped her without being asked, so magnetic that gods feared the chaos she could cause with a single glance. That kind of description sets a standard, and in the ancient world, standards mattered. Let's go to ancient Greece, where women weren't allowed to vote, own land freely, or even walk alone in public spaces depending on the region, but they were expected to be beautiful, not just presentable, not just clean, beautiful. And beautiful meant looking, behaving, and moving like Aphrodite, or at least the version of her created by artists and storytellers. Delicate features, clear skin, graceful posture, a soft voice, modest yet enticing. That combination, modesty and magnetism, became the impossible balance many women were expected to master, to be seen, but not too much, to be desirable, but not provocative, to be admired, but not pursued too openly. It's a pattern that's echoed through centuries, and Aphrodite sat at the center of it. Statues of her were everywhere, in temples, in homes, in city squares, not statues of her holding books, not statues of her giving speeches, but statues of her body, curved, nude, posed. The most famous, the Venus de Milo, found on the island of Melos in 1820, she became the visual template for Western beauty. And though her arms are missing, people focused on everything else, the angle of her hips, the shape of her torso, the slight tilt of her head. She wasn't smiling, she wasn't moving, she just was. And that was enough. She didn't need to try. That was the appeal, and that's where the pressure began. Because women, real women, don't wake up looking like statues. They sweat, they age, they carry babies, they get sick, they cry, they walk into rooms where no one notices them, they get rejected, But the idea of Aphrodite, of Venus, never had to deal with any of that. She was always adored, she was always untouched, she was the ideal. And when an ideal becomes part of your culture, everything starts to orbit around it. In the Roman Empire, upper-class women often copied Aphrodite's hairstyles, curls pinned into high, round buns, flowing garments, jewelry placed not for practicality but for symbolism, pearls for purity, gold for allure. In the Renaissance, artists used her body to define womanhood. Even when painting biblical scenes, they often slipped in Venus-like features, the curved waist, the soft stomach, the gentle smile. Even fashion was designed around her proportions. Corsets, draping fabrics, makeup recipes using lead and chalk to mimic the glow of marble. And in every painting, every sculpture, every written description, the same silent message was passed down. This is what a woman should look like. And if you didn't, if your body didn't match the curve of a statue, if your skin didn't reflect the light just so, then you were taught to try harder. That's Aphrodite's shadow. And yet, it's not all criticism, because the story doesn't end there. Many women also reclaimed her image, reimagined it, not just as something to chase, but as something to own. Because while Aphrodite was an ideal, she was also a force. She wasn't passive, she wasn't waiting around. She took what she wanted. She caused gods to panic. She made her own choices. She demanded worship. And for some women, especially in later centuries, that became a symbol of empowerment. The idea that beauty could be a weapon, that femininity could be leverage, that softness could lead. In the 19th and 20th centuries, as feminism began to rise, Aphrodite's story took on new meaning. She became a case study. Was she a victim of objectification, or was she a woman who weaponized how others saw her? Was she trapped in her beauty, or did she rule through it? Different thinkers came to different conclusions, and maybe that's the point. Because Aphrodite wasn't one thing, she was contradiction. She was admired and resented, copied and feared, worshipped and blamed. In modern pop culture, she still shows up, even when she isn't named. You'll find her in the magazine industry, the makeup world, social media, plastic surgery clinics, self-love movements. She's in every product that promises to make you more desirable. And she's also in every voice that tells you, you're already enough. She's not just the ideal, she's the debate around the ideal. And whether you see her as a curse or a crown, she's still there, still lingering in dressing rooms, in dating profiles, in the glance someone gives their reflection when no one's looking. Aphrodite never needed to shout. She whispered, and thousands of years later, people still hear it. There's something you notice when you start looking closely at the stories around Aphrodite. Almost no one stays the same. Her presence, sometimes soft, sometimes overwhelming, changes people, not always in the way they expect, and not always in the way they want. But transformation is part of her nature, because love, real love, doesn't leave things untouched. It breaks routines. It shifts values. It stretches the way we see ourselves. Aphrodite, as a goddess, doesn't always announce her arrival. She slips in, unnoticed. At first, but once she's there, something begins to shift. Let's look at the transformations she caused, some of them symbolic, others physical. One of the earliest and most tragic examples is Myrrha. We've spoken about her before, the woman cursed to fall in love with her own father. In some versions of the myth, Myrrha prays to the gods, not for forgiveness, but for escape. She doesn't ask to undo what's been done. She doesn't try to explain it away. She just wants out. And the gods answer. They turn her into a myrrha tree. She becomes something entirely different. No longer human, no longer a daughter, no longer a sinner, or victim, or anything else. Just bark, sapphire, silence. It's a disturbing story, but also revealing. Because in that transformation, there's a kind of twisted mercy. She's taken out of her pain, but also out of herself. And from that tree, new life is born. Adonis, Aphrodite's great love. So the tree isn't just an escape, it's a bridge, from pain to something else. Another transformation, Pygmalion's statue. This is one of the rare happy endings in Aphrodite's myths. A sculptor, disgusted by what he sees as the flaws of real women, creates a statue, perfect, cold, beautiful, and over time, he falls in love with it. He treats it like a real person, talks to it, dresses it, kisses its forehead. And eventually, during a festival to Aphrodite, he makes a simple request. "Please," he says, "let me have a wife as perfect as this statue." Aphrodite listens. And that night, when he returns home, the statue moves. It breathes, looks at him, becomes real. She is no longer ivory, no longer art. She's alive. This transformation, unlike mirrors, is a gift, a miracle, but it's also a commentary that love, even love projected onto something lifeless, can be answered. That the line between fantasy and reality is thinner than we think, especially when Aphrodite is listening. Then there's Hermaphrodites, the child of Aphrodite and Hermes. We covered his story earlier, but let's revisit it through the lens of transformation. Born male, raised with beauty and grace. But one day, a nymph named Salmacis sees him bathing and falls in love. He doesn't return her affection. He wants distance. She wants union. She prays to the gods that they may never be separated. And they listen. Their bodies are fused, permanently. Hermaphrodites becomes a being of both sexes, a symbol of unity, of balance, of blurred lines. It's not a punishment, it's a new form. And for Aphrodite, the goddess of love, connection, and fusion, this transformation is completely aligned with her essence. She doesn't deal in binaries, she deals in convergence, in one becoming two, or two becoming one. Now, not all transformations were so dramatic. Sometimes, the change Aphrodite brought was emotional, quiet, hidden. In the myth of Anchises, for example, the Trojan shepherd she seduces, the transformation is internal. He goes from an unknown herder to the father of a demigod, a man whose bloodline will lead to the founding of Rome. His life changes not because Aphrodite gave him wealth or status, but because she gave him meaning. He becomes part of a larger story. She does the same for Paris. Before he meets Aphrodite, Paris is just a Trojan prince, one of many, not a hero, not a villain, just a name. But after he awards her the golden apple, and she rewards him with Helen, Paris becomes the spark of the Trojan War. He goes from obscurity to legend, and yes, his story ends in ruin. But even ruin can be a kind of transformation, because when Aphrodite touches someone, their story no longer belongs to just them. It becomes part of something bigger. Even the gods aren't immune. When Aphrodite enters a room, Ares, the god of war, softens. He doesn't become peaceful, exactly, but he becomes human, emotional, attached. The fierce, untouchable warrior becomes a partner, vulnerable, protective. That's a transformation in itself, because love doesn't just change the people you'd expect. It changes the ones who swore they'd never be changed. There's another kind of transformation Aphrodite inspired, the ritual kind. In temples across the Greek world, initiation ceremonies were often held in her honor. Young girls stepping into womanhood, brides preparing for marriage, women hoping to become mothers. These weren't ceremonies with swords or crowns. They involved perfume, water, mirrors, hair, symbols of identity. These rituals didn't make someone physically different, but emotionally, they crossed a threshold. Before the ritual, they were one version of themselves. Afterwards, they were someone else. That's the kind of transformation Aphrodite governed best. The invisible kind, the kind you feel but can't name. The shift from not knowing to knowing, from waiting to becoming. And here's the thing, even when Aphrodite herself didn't change, she caused change in others. She didn't need to evolve. Everyone else evolved around her, because that's what love does. It makes you look at the world differently. It makes you question who you are. It challenges what you thought you wanted. And when it leaves, if it leaves, you're never quite the same. That's why Aphrodite was feared as much as she was adored. Not because she was cruel, but because she was powerful, and power, when quiet, is even harder to resist, and harder to resist. And gods aren't supposed to age. That's part of their job description. They're eternal, timeless, unchanging. But the stories we tell about gods, those evolve. They bend, they twist, they shift based on who's telling them, and why. And if you want proof of that, just look at Aphrodite. Because unlike other Olympians, she didn't disappear when her temples fell, she moved forward. Let's start at the beginning, or rather the second beginning, because when Rome absorbed Greece, they took Aphrodite with them, but gave her a new name, Venus. At first glance, Venus was simply the Roman version of Aphrodite, a direct translation, same goddess, different language, but Rome was more than a different culture. It had a different agenda. Where Greece loved chaos and contradiction, Rome loved order, structure, empire. And so, Venus became something slightly different, more domestic, more strategic, less wild. She wasn't just the goddess of passion, she became the goddess of fertility, victory, civic virtue, and perhaps most importantly, ancestry. Because Rome needed a divine mother, a root system, a symbol of continuity, and so they claimed that Aeneas, the hero of their founding epic, the Aeneas was the son of Venus, that made Venus not just a goddess, but the literal mother of the Roman people. She wasn't just beautiful, she was legacy. Even Julius Caesar claimed descent from her, through his family line, the gens Julia. He built temples to her, dedicated statues to her, placed her image on coins. She became state propaganda, wrapped in gold and marble. But even as she was formalized, codified, made into an emblem of empire, she retained her softness. Artists still showed her rising from the sea, draped in silk, surrounded by doves and roses. She could be a political symbol, and a personal one, a goddess of Rome, and of romance. Then came Christianity, and everything changed. Overnight, the old gods became pagan, dangerous, unwelcome. Temples were repurposed, festivals cancelled, statues destroyed. You'd think Aphrodite, so tied to the body, to sensuality, to pleasure, would have vanished completely. But she didn't. She simply went underground, not physically, but symbolically. She began to appear in stories that weren't hers. She became the unnamed woman in moral warnings. She became Eve, blamed for desire. She became Lilith, whispered about in shadows. And as medieval Europe embraced modesty, chastity and control, Aphrodite took a different form. She re-emerged, centuries later, in art. During the Renaissance, something stirred. Humanism, curiosity, a revival of classical thinking, and suddenly, old myths were in fashion again, but not as religion, as inspiration. Painters like Botticelli resurrected her with elegance. His masterpiece, The Birth of Venus, showed her standing on a shell, wind in her hair, surrounded by soft pinks and delicate light. She wasn't just a goddess anymore, she was idealized beauty, and people were fascinated. They didn't worship her, but they studied her, copied her. Venus appeared in sculptures, murals, mosaics, again and again. Even when the church disapproved, artists found ways to smuggle her into the frame, because Aphrodite, by any name, couldn't be forgotten. She was too human. She wasn't a god of thunder or death, she was a god of longing, of looking at someone, and feeling something you can't explain. And that's timeless. In the 18th and 19th centuries, as psychology emerged, Aphrodite entered another realm. She became a metaphor, a case study in desire, repression and fantasy. Freud and his followers explored the Venus complex, the idea of idealizing someone so much that they become untouchable. She also entered fashion, perfume, and advertising. Venus razors, Aphrodite skincare, love potions named after her. Her image, sculpted or painted, was used to sell everything. And she adapted, because she didn't need temples anymore. She had billboards. Now in the digital age, she hasn't slowed down. You'll find her in music videos, in online avatars, in AI art, in influencer culture. She's the unspoken blueprint behind filters and beauty trends. The one whose presence is felt in every comment that says, "You're glowing." But here's the twist. Modern culture doesn't just worship her, it also questions her, because now beauty ideals are scrutinized. Feminism has re-examined what it means to idolize a woman for her looks, and Aphrodite has become a symbol of both the problem and the possibility. A reminder of how often women have been reduced to their desirability, but also a celebration of how desire itself can be powerful, bold, liberating. In some modern retellings, in books, shows, reimagined myths, Aphrodite speaks for herself. She's sarcastic, sharp, self-aware. She knows how she's been used, and she plays with it. That's her final transformation, from silent marble to speaking myth, not just observed, but heard. Because Aphrodite didn't just outlive her worshippers, she outsmarted time by never standing still. So what do we do with Aphrodite now? She's everywhere, and nowhere. She isn't worshipped on temple steps anymore. She doesn't demand burnt offerings or golden altars, but her shadow still lives in us. She still appears, not in clouds or waves, but in mirrors, in moods, in the weight of longing you can't explain. And in the last 100 years, we've started to ask different questions about her. Questions the ancients never thought to ask. What if Aphrodite wasn't just the goddess of love, but the goddess of survival, of adaptation, of existing in a world that keeps trying to tell you what your beauty means, and choosing for yourself anyway? Modern reinterpretations of her don't focus on her lovers anymore. Not as much. They focus on her voice. Writers reimagine her not as a seductress, but as a strategist, not a homewrecker, but a woman tired of being blamed for other people's desires. Some see her as a symbol of divine femininity, not soft but steel wrapped in silk. Others portray her as deeply lonely, a being everyone wants, but few truly see. Psychologists interpret her as a human archetype, the part of us that seeks connection, validation, meaning. Artists use her as a muse to explore vulnerability. Music videos name-drop her. Graphic novels bring her into new wars. Feminist thinkers debate her legacy. And in all of this, she keeps evolving, because Aphrodite was never about staying in one shape. She was never just about romantic love. She was about the need to be known. And that's a feeling that spans every era. Today she's less a goddess, and more a question. What does it mean to be beautiful, when beauty is a currency? What does it mean to be loved, when love is transactional? What does it mean to own your presence, when others keep defining it for you? And maybe that's why she endures, because she reflects us. Every time we scroll past an image, and feel not good enough, Aphrodite is there. Every time someone tells us we're too much or not enough, Aphrodite is there. Every time we fall for someone we shouldn't, every time we want something we can't name, she's in all of it, not as a force controlling us, but as a mirror, saying this too is love. Messy, complicated, human. She never asked for temples, she asked to be remembered, and somehow, we always do. Even if we don't say her name, even if we don't believe in gods, we believe in the ache, the spark, the moment you catch someone's eye, and everything changes. That's Aphrodite, still here, still watching, still waiting to be understood, not as the goddess of love, but as the goddess of being seen. And now, we've reached the end. You've just traveled through centuries of mythology, culture, worship, art, philosophy, psychology and longing, all orbiting one figure, Aphrodite. She was more than a name carved into stone. She was the emotion beneath the surface, the question behind the mirror, the heartbeat in stories told in whispers. Whether you see her as myth or metaphor, she's never really been about gods and altars. She's been about you, what you want, what you fear, what you hope someone sees when they look at you. So, if you've made it this far, I hope you feel a little calmer, maybe a little closer to the past, or even a bit more connected to yourself. And if you're listening in the dark right now, maybe already drifting off, let her stay with you just a little longer. Not the goddess of statues or scrolls, but the one in your chest when you remember someone's smile. The one in your thoughts when a stranger's glance lingers for just a second too long. And if you're still awake, don't forget to subscribe. If you enjoy long, calm stories like this, let us know in the comments where you're listening from, and what time it is where you are. We always love reading that. Until next time, rest easy, and may you always remember love, the kind that Aphrodite stood for, isn't always soft or simple, but it's always worth remembering. Good night.